Marcus Bailey stood at gate 23, a mix of exhaustion and relief washing over him. The last few weeks had been grueling, but he was finally heading to Los Angeles for a much-needed break. As a detective with the New York Police Department, he had seen his fair share of tough cases, but this latest one had drained him more than usual. The murder of a young woman in Brooklyn had captured media attention, and his department had been working around the clock to solve it. Final boarding call for Flight 287 to Los Angeles, the gate agent announced, her voice crisp and professional. Marcus shifted the strap of his leather bag on his shoulder and made his way toward the gate, handing over his boarding pass. "Have a good flight, Mr. Bailey," the agent said with a smile. Marcus nodded, returning the smile with a slight tip of his head. As he walked down the jet bridge, he could already feel the tension in his shoulders start to ease. The idea of being off duty for a few days, away from the crime scenes, paperwork, and the constant pressure of solving cases, was like a weight lifting from his chest. He stepped onto the plane, scanning the rows for his seat. Row 18, seat C. As he made his way down the aisle, he noticed the usual pre-flight chaos. Passengers stowing bags, flight attendants offering assistance, and people settling into their seats. He moved carefully past a family with 2 young children, the mother struggling to get the toddler to sit still, while the father stuffed oversized carry-ons into the overhead compartment. As Marcus reached his seat, a middle-aged white woman with graying blonde hair glanced up at him from behind her magazine. Gloria Mills, a woman in her late 50s, had boarded earlier and had been watching the other passengers with a nervous energy. She had seen Marcus when he first stepped onto the plane, and her eyes followed him as he took his seat near the emergency exit. There was something about him that made her uneasy, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Perhaps it was his height, his build, strong but unassuming. Or maybe it was the fact that he looked so calm, too calm in her opinion. It was almost unsettling how relaxed he seemed, as though he was pretending to blend in. Her mind immediately went to the news stories she consumed daily, stories that spoke of hidden threats and terrorists posing as regular passengers. Marcus, unaware of Gloria's scrutiny, placed his bag under the seat in front of him and settled into his chair. He was used to people giving him strange looks. He had been a black man in law enforcement for nearly 2 decades, and he knew how to handle being the subject of suspicion. His mother had taught him early on how to navigate a world that wasn't always welcoming. Her voice echoed in his mind, telling him to always keep his cool, to never give anyone a reason to question his actions. As he adjusted his seatbelt and glanced out of the window, he allowed himself a rare moment of relaxation. The view of the runway stretched out before him, the sun casting long shadows as the plane prepared for takeoff. For the first time in a long time, he didn't have to worry about anything or anyone. But a few rows back, Gloria's unease was growing. She watched Marcus for a few more moments before lowering her magazine and leaning into the aisle. "Excuse me." She called softly to one of the flight attendants making her way down the aisle. Linda, a seasoned flight attendant in her early 40s, turned toward Gloria with a polite smile. "Yes, ma'am. How can I assist you?" Gloria gestured subtly toward Marcus, keeping her voice low. "That man by the emergency exit? Are you sure it's safe to have someone like him sitting there?" Linda's smile faltered slightly, but her professionalism remained intact. She glanced toward Marcus, who was quietly reading a book, and then back to Gloria. "Ma'am, I can assure you that all passengers on board have been thoroughly screened by security. Everyone is seated in compliance with safety regulations." Gloria pursed her lips, dissatisfied with the response. "I just think, with everything going on these days, well, you hear things on the news. It's better to be cautious, right?" Linda nodded, though her tone became firmer. "If there's anything specific you're concerned about, Please don't hesitate to let us know, but I assure you, there's nothing to worry about." Gloria leaned back in her seat, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. Linda walked away, continuing her pre-flight checks, but Gloria couldn't let go of the nagging feeling in her chest. She continued to watch Marcus, her mind racing with the possibilities of what he could be hiding. The engines roared as the plane lifted off, pressing the passengers back into their seats. Marcus adjusted his position, trying to get comfortable as the plane leveled out at cruising altitude. He had been through this routine so many times, boarding, taking off, the in-flight hum of engines, that he could almost do it in his sleep. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't on assignment. This time, he was just a passenger, heading to LA for a brief escape from his everyday life. He reached down to unzip his carry-on bag and pulled out a small bottle of water and a pill case. The stress of his job had taken a toll on his health, and the doctor had prescribed medication to help manage his blood pressure. He checked the label, then took a sip of water before placing both items back into his bag. Gloria watched every movement. Her heart began to race as she saw him open the bag again. What was he doing? Why did he keep checking the bag like that? To her, it seemed like he was being too careful, too deliberate, as though he was making sure something inside stayed hidden. Her pulse quickened as she imagined all the possibilities, dangerous ones, that could be lurking in that bag. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to do something. Gloria raised her hand again, this time more urgently, signaling for Linda as the flight attendant made her way down the aisle with the drink cart. Linda approached with the same calm professionalism. "Yes, ma'am. Is there something else I can help you with?" Gloria leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper, though her agitation was clear. "I've been watching that man. He keeps checking his bag, like he's nervous about something. I really think you should look into it." Linda glanced toward Marcus, who had now returned to his book, and then back at Gloria. "Ma'am, unless there's a clear indication of a problem, we can't interfere with other passengers' belongings. His behavior seems normal." Gloria's face tightened, her frustration growing. "Normal? How can you say that? You know as well as I do that people like him always act normal until they don't. I've seen it on the news. You can't just ignore this." Linda's smile faded slightly, but she remained calm. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but we have procedures in place for passenger safety. We cannot take action without a reason to believe there's a threat. If you notice anything else specific, please let me know." Gloria huffed, crossing her arms in front of her chest. "You people never take these things seriously until it's too late," she muttered under her breath. Linda heard the comment, but chose not to respond. Instead, she gave Gloria a polite nod and moved down the aisle, though her mind lingered on the exchange. She had been working in the airline industry for years and had seen her fair share of suspicious passengers, but something about this situation felt different. Gloria's intensity was unsettling, and Linda made a mental note to keep an eye on her for the remainder of the flight. Gloria, however, was far from reassured. She couldn't understand why no one else seemed to be concerned. How could they all be so complacent? She looked around the cabin, her eyes scanning the faces of the other passengers. They were all absorbed in their own worlds, watching movies, reading books, or sleeping. She leaned over to the woman sitting next to her, a middle-aged lady flipping through a fashion magazine. "Excuse me," Gloria whispered, trying to keep her voice down. "Do you see that man by the emergency exit? Doesn't he seem off to you?" The woman glanced up, following Gloria's gaze toward Marcus. She looked at him for a brief moment, then turned back to Gloria with a non-committal shrug. "I don't know. He looks fine to me. What's the problem?" Gloria frowned, irritated by the woman's indifference. "He keeps checking his bag. I've been watching him since we boarded. It's suspicious." The woman hesitated, looking at Marcus again before giving Gloria a polite smile. I'm sure it's nothing. If the flight attendants aren't worried, it's probably not a big deal. Gloria's frustration deepened. How could these people be so blind? She turned away from the woman, her mind spinning with thoughts of danger and disaster. If no one else was going to do anything, she'd have to take matters into her own hands. As the flight progressed, Gloria's anxiety only grew. Every time Marcus reached down to adjust his bag or take a sip of water, her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. She was convinced that something was wrong, seriously wrong, and she couldn't just sit by and do nothing. By now, she had tried to alert a few other passengers to what she perceived as a threat, but no one seemed to share her concern. One woman even politely told her that she was probably overreacting, but Gloria knew better. She had seen this kind of behavior on the news. People who seemed calm and collected, only to later reveal their dangerous intentions. She wasn't about to be one of those people who did nothing while disaster unfolded in front of her. When the flight attendant passed by again, Gloria stood up abruptly, her voice sharper than before. Excuse me, we need to do something about this. Linda, the flight attendant, turned to face her, concern flickering across her face as she realized Gloria was becoming more agitated. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down, she said, trying to keep her tone gentle but firm. You're disturbing the other passengers. Gloria's face flushed with indignation. Calm down? Are you serious? I'm trying to stop something terrible from happening, and you want me to just sit here and do nothing? By now, several passengers had turned to look at the commotion. Marcus, sensing the tension, looked up from his book. His eyes met Gloria's for the first time, and he saw the wild determination in her gaze. I demand that his bag be searched, Gloria insisted, pointing directly at Marcus. He's hiding something dangerous, and you're all too blind to see it. Linda stepped between them, her voice firm but calm. Ma'am, please lower your voice. There is no reason to believe there is any threat on this plane. You need to return to your seat. Marcus remained silent, watching the scene unfold with an unsettling sense of familiarity. He had seen people like Gloria before, people who made assumptions based on skin color, who let their fears turn into accusations. He had learned over the years not to engage, not to feed into their paranoia. But Gloria wasn't backing down. No, I won't sit down until something is done. I know I'm right, and you'll all regret it if you don't listen to me. Marcus took a deep breath, setting his book aside and standing slowly. He kept his movements calm and measured, not wanting to escalate the situation further. Ma'am, I can assure you there's nothing dangerous in my bag, he said quietly. I'm just a passenger trying to get to Los Angeles like everyone else. Gloria's eyes narrowed, her voice rising again. I don't believe you. You're too calm. Something. You're up to something, and I know it. Linda motioned to another flight attendant, signaling for backup. She turned back to Gloria, her patience wearing thin. Ma'am, if you do not return to your seat, we will have to involve the captain. Please, sit down and stop causing a disturbance. Gloria's face flushed even redder, but before she could respond, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his badge. Marcus held the badge up for everyone to see. The silver gleam of the NYPD shield caught the overhead light as he spoke. My name is Detective Marcus Bailey, he announced, his voice calm but firm. I'm an undercover detective with the New York Police Department. I've been on assignment, and the medication in my bag is for a heart condition. I apologize if my behavior caused any concern, but I assure you, there is no threat here. For a moment, the entire cabin seemed to freeze. Passengers who had been watching the altercation fell silent, their eyes fixed on the badge in Marcus's hand. Linda let out a slow breath, relieved that Marcus had taken control of the situation with such grace. One by one, the passengers began to nod in understanding, the tension easing as they realized the man Gloria had accused was not a threat, but an officer of the law. A few of them murmured quietly to each other, shaking their heads in disbelief at how quickly things had spiraled. But at the back of the plane, Gloria was anything but calm. Her face had paled at the sight of the badge, and for a moment it looked as though she might back down. The realization of what she had done, publicly accusing an innocent man, hit her like a cold wave. Then, just as quickly, her fear and pride flared up again. She couldn't admit that she had been wrong, not after everything she had said. There had to be more to this than what Marcus was showing them. "How do we know that's real?" Gloria demanded, her voice still sharp. "How do we know you're not lying about all of this?" Linda stepped forward again, this time with a firmer hand. "Ma'am, please. Detective Bailey has shown you his identification, and there is no reason to believe he is anything but who he says he is. You need to return to your seat now." But Gloria wasn't ready to let go of her paranoia. "This is all a cover," she muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "He's hiding something. I know it." The tension in the cabin hadn't completely dissipated, but most of the passengers had begun to relax now that Marcus had revealed his identity. Still, Linda knew they needed to keep an eye on Gloria. The woman wasn't backing down, and the last thing they needed was another outburst. As the plane continued its journey westward, Linda instructed the other flight attendants to stay alert, particularly near the emergency exits. Jim, one of the senior attendants, kept watch over Gloria, who had reluctantly taken her seat again, though her eyes continued to dart suspiciously toward Marcus. Marcus, on the other hand, had returned to his book, though his mind was still buzzing with the events of the last few minutes. He had dealt with worse situations in his line of work, but being targeted like this, based on nothing more than someone's assumptions, always left a sour taste in his mouth. He had grown used to it, being watched, being doubted. But that didn't make it any easier. As the hours passed, Marcus tried to lose himself in the book, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Gloria's paranoia wasn't finished yet. He glanced around the cabin, watching the other passengers. Most had settled back into their routines, and a few had even nodded to him in silent acknowledgement after his badge reveal. They seemed to understand that Gloria's accusations had been baseless. But Marcus couldn't help feeling uneasy. Meanwhile, Gloria sat fuming in her seat, her thoughts spiraling out of control. How could everyone be so blind? How could they just accept Marcus's story without questioning it further? She glanced around the cabin looking for someone, anyone who might share her concerns, but all she saw were indifferent faces. No one seemed to be paying her any mind now, and that only made her more determined to expose the truth. In her mind, Marcus was still a threat. He had to be. No one could be that calm and innocent, especially after being accused like that. It just didn't add up. She had watched enough TV shows to know that criminals often pretended to be something they weren't, and she wasn't about to let him get away with whatever he was planning. Her thoughts churned as she eyed the bag Marcus had tucked beneath his seat. What was really in there? Why had he been so careful with it? She imagined all sorts of dangerous possibilities, each one more frightening than the last. Finally, unable to sit still any longer, Gloria unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up again. This time her movements were quicker, more determined. She wasn't going to let this go. "Excuse me." Gloria's voice cut through the quiet hum of the cabin, drawing the attention of passengers once more. Linda, who had been checking in with another passenger, looked up sharply. "Ma'am, please sit down." "No." Gloria's voice rose, her face flushed with anger and frustration. "I won't sit down. You all need to listen to me. This man is dangerous, and I'm not going to just sit by and watch while he—" Before Gloria could finish, Marcus stood up again, this time moving deliberately to block her path. He kept his voice calm, but there was an edge to it now. "Ma'am, I've already explained everything." I'm not a threat, and I'm asking you to stop this before it gets worse. Gloria's eyes blazed with indignation. Worse? You think this is bad? Wait until everyone realizes what you're hiding. You can't fool me. Linda moved quickly to intervene, positioning herself between Marcus and Gloria. Ma'am, you are creating a disturbance. If you do not return to your seat, we will have no choice but to take further action. The tension in the air was palpable. Passengers were whispering to each other now, some craning their necks to get a better view of the escalating situation. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, but he remained calm, his training kicking in as he tried to de-escalate the situation. Gloria, however, was beyond reasoning. Her fear had consumed her, and now all she could see was a dangerous man standing in front of her, a man who had somehow fooled everyone else on the plane. But not her. I'm not going to let this go, Gloria muttered, her voice shaking with emotion. Someone has to do something. Linda's patience had reached its limit. She signaled to Jim and the other flight attendants, and they quickly moved to assist. Together, they managed to guide Gloria back to her seat, though she continued to mutter angrily under her breath. As Gloria finally sat down, Marcus took a step back, relieved that the situation hadn't escalated further. But he knew this wasn't over. Gloria's paranoia had taken root, and unless something drastic happened, she wasn't going to stop. Linda, sensing the urgency of the situation, went to the front of the plane to notify the captain. She explained the disturbance, and Captain Harris, a seasoned pilot with decades of experience, listened carefully. If she causes another scene, we'll have to involve law enforcement when we land, he said gravely. We can't let this escalate any further. Linda nodded and returned to the cabin, her mind racing with the responsibility of keeping the passengers safe. She couldn't let this situation spiral out of control. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, the tension in the cabin was still thick. Gloria sat rigidly in her seat, her eyes burning with frustration. Despite the assurances from the flight crew and Marcus's badge, she was convinced that something was wrong. And now, as the plane neared its destination, she knew her time was running out. Marcus, for his part, remained vigilant. He could feel the tension in the air, the way Gloria's eyes kept flicking toward him, even as the plane prepared to land. He had seen situations like this before, where paranoia took hold of someone and wouldn't let go, and he knew it wouldn't take much to set her off again. Linda moved through the cabin one last time, ensuring that all passengers were buckled in and ready for landing. She exchanged a brief glance with Jim, who had been keeping a close eye on Gloria throughout the flight. We're almost there, she whispered to him. Let's just hope we can get through the landing without any more incidents. Jim nodded, his eyes never leaving Gloria. As the plane touched down on the runway, there was a collective sigh of relief from the passengers. The tension that had gripped the cabin for most of the flight seemed to ease, replaced by the usual sounds of unbuckling seatbelts and the rustle of luggage being gathered from the overhead bins. But Gloria wasn't done yet. As soon as the seatbelt sign turned off, she stood up abruptly, her face flushed with determination. I'm not letting this go, she shouted, her voice cutting through the cabin. Marcus sighed, already knowing what was coming. He remained seated, his eyes calm but watchful. 2 uniformed security officers had boarded the plane, ready to assist with any potential disturbances. Linda quickly motioned for them to approach, and they moved toward Gloria's seat. Ma'am, we need you to come with us, one of the officers said, his voice calm but authoritative. Gloria's eyes widened in disbelief. Me? What about him? He's the one you should be arresting. The officer remained calm. Ma'am, we just need to speak with you. Please come with us, and we can sort everything out. Gloria's face flushed even redder as she realized she was losing the support of the other passengers. Her eyes darted around, searching for someone, anyone to back her up. but all she saw were disapproving glances and shaking heads. With no other option, Gloria reluctantly allowed the officers to guide her off the plane, though she continued to mutter under her breath about being right. As she was escorted away, Marcus finally stood up, grabbing his carry-on bag from beneath the seat. He exchanged a brief glance with Linda, who gave him a tired but relieved smile. "Thank you for your patience," she said quietly. "I'm sorry for everything that happened." Marcus nodded. "You handled it well. Sometimes people just can't let go of their fears." Linda sighed, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "Yeah, I've seen it before, but it never gets easier." As Marcus made his way off the plane and into the terminal, he couldn't help but reflect on the events of the flight. It wasn't the first time he had been targeted because of someone's baseless suspicions, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But he had learned long ago not to let it get to him. Behind him, the passengers of Flight 287 began to disembark, many of them still whispering about the incident. Some glanced in his direction, while others hurried past, eager to leave the tense atmosphere of the plane behind. For Marcus, the day wasn't over yet. There would be reports to file and questions to answer. But for now, he was content to let the noise of the airport wash over him, a reminder that life moved on, even after moments of conflict and misunderstanding.